This is Lynn Fraser. Welcome to the 2023 Radical Recovery Summit. I'm excited today to be talking with Dr. Scott Lyons. He is dedicated to teaching embodiment as a way of exploring human development, healing, growth, and transformation. He's a clinical psychologist, a doctor of osteopathy, and a mind-body medicine practitioner. He created the Embody Lab, which is a hub for embodied education, self-discovery and healing, and developed the Somatic Stress Release process to restore our biological adaptation system. His final advice at the end of the interview is to rest and play. I think you'll enjoy this interview as well. Welcome. I'm here today with Dr. Scott Lyons, and I would just like to start with having you tell us a little bit about you, your work, how you got into this work, and then we'll go from there.
Sure.
What would you like to say to start?
So my main focus right now is with the Embody Lab, which is an online hub for embodied and somatic education, focusing on a lot of trauma therapy work, somatic attachment type work, really bringing kind of a home base for all these body-based psychotherapies, somatic psychology, somatic therapy approaches, and transformational work, so social transformational work as well. And I'm a licensed psychologist. I also am an osteopath, manual osteopath, and body-mind centering practitioner, and studied physics a lot. So I have a lot of varied interests in my work, and they sort of all blend together. Just finished a book that's coming out in a few months called Addicted to Drama, Healing the Dependency on Crisis and Chaos. And it's a fun book. It was a labor of love to write, but I'm really excited for it to come out. And that's been primarily my focus. I still see clients one day a week, but really focusing on these sort of other expanded processes of how do we bring this embodied education models and somatic therapies into a broader audience and make them more readily available.
That all sounds so good. And I can think of 20 questions right now that I'd like for us to explore. But maybe we could start with your book. How did you choose that as the topic for your book?
Yeah. Well, I started researching it as a doctoral student. Mm-hmm. I needed something. And I'd always heard people talk about and say, like, drama queen or addicted to drama. And I was like, it's such a common term. And then when you go to look it up in the DSM or any like formalized places where you could get sort of peer-reviewed information or anywhere really, it just wasn't available. And, and also recognizing my own sort of inner addiction to drama as a kid, as a young adult, into my 20s when I worked in the arts. I used to be an opera director and choreographer. And there's a little bit of drama in there.
Literally.
Literally. And my own healing process within that was really part of that inspiration too. And so the book took, its own transformational process of looking at and doing a lot of research, a lot of qualitative and quantitative research about, like, what is this? Why is it such a common thing? We all know someone who's addicted to drama, never ourselves. Never. It's always our mother-in-law, right, or our sibling, or
Right.
And why is it such a common concept, but just unrecognized or unresearched? And so it really took several years to do the research on that and write this book. And it really morphed into also, like, how is our social climate, our social media climate included, in that really creating the conditions for an endemic of an addiction to drama. So we might start seeing an expanded version of sort of individualized patterns, but basically becoming a generalized norm in our culture.
Well, there's so many kind of obvious ways that works out. But what's the answer to the question of why are so many people addicted to drama?
Well, there's no simple answer. And, I think one of the things I can say is I think the sort of common concept of like, these are individuals just seeking attention is a pretty misinformed conception. That it's not just some glorified desire for like, hey, pay attention to me. Because if it was really about pay attention to me, then it would be for those people, they would be satisfied with that. Those of us who are addicted to drama or those who we know, but it doesn't stop there. Because the challenge of that is consistently, perhaps there is that desire to be seen or to be met, but it's the simultaneous tension of being unable to receive that. The vulnerability of being seen because signals internally a sense of danger. And so we have this continual tension within that it's not just about seeking attention, else that pattern would have been completed upon receiving attention.
Right.
And so it's a lot more deeper layers of internal wounds, very deep wounds that then build these layers of compensation. And, the strange thing about addiction and drama is that drama is the medicine for so many people. We think about it from our end of going, oh my gosh, get out of my face with all your drama. Right. But if we actually turn it around and reframe it and recognize that it may make no sense, but it never needs to make sense, because really it's about making sensation to feel alive. And that sensation emerges from the chaos that's created or found. And so drama is the medicine that keeps someone basically in their survival response and protected from having to address a very deep internalized wound, and not just a wound that's internalized, but generational wounds or wounds that are within our culture that we're unable to absorb or receive or accept or process because they are so big, and yet they sit on us or they sit within us.
Mm-hmm. What's your sense of what's going on in the nervous system and the brain?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of sort of stepping outside of just the nervous system. I know it's a hot subject and a very popular thing to talk about, but as a integrative practitioner, I really like to look at the whole system. I mean, I'm happy to talk about the nervous system, but I'll say that that's just one flavor of a whole holistic process that perhaps is created a different baseline, because it's not just our nervous system that creates our homeostatic baseline. It's the entirety of the multiplicity of systems acting out like an orchestra. Like the string section of or the violin section of this entire band, rather, is the nervous system. And then we have our endocrine system, and then that's a side subject. But I would say, from like a polyvagal informed perspective, for example, it's, if we think about the example, one of the examples I give in the book is I grew up in Minnesota, or Dakota land, as also known. And when you get stuck in the snow, so you're frozen in the snow, basically.
I grew up in Saskatchewan.
Oh, you know? Okay.
Yeah, I know about deep snow and cold.
You know what it's like when you get stuck, and you rev, you push on the gas and you rev it and you try to melt the snow.
Right.
And then you try to get out. And that's essentially what's happening in the nervous system. It is both frozen, and there's an internal process of trying to rev the engine to try to get it out of a freeze. And so you have this constant dual tension of being able, a desire to stay frozen as a protection, and a desire to be alive. And so that revving energy creates a lot of chaos. And that chaos emerges in behavior or thoughts, or in manifested in relationships often. But underneath, there's this tension between trying to get out of the freeze and trying to stay in.
So I'm interested in what you said about being an osteopath too.
Yeah.
I've had osteopathic treatments for many years and am a big believer in them. And some of the things that I've discovered through that, one of the things is, I've been teaching meditation and breathing for 25 years, and I breathe diaphragmatically. I know I do.
Yeah.
And it was about 5 or 6 years ago, my osteopath said, yes, you're breathing diaphragmatically, but your diaphragm is stuck. It's not moving freely. And I was completely shocked by that. And I can also see why, it's, I'm sure, from years of trauma and being frozen. And so what are your reflections from the osteopathic kind of point of view around working with trauma in the body?
We've thought about trauma from different fields.
Mm-hmm.
I'm taking the lens through the psychological lens, or I'm taking it even from the nutritional lens, or I'm taking it through how it's like stuck from a very manual perspective. And, and there's a reason for that, is because a long time ago, there was a split in the conception of this holistic concept that it is all one process and manifestation. And we created careers based on that. So we have psychologists, and we have osteopaths or body workers, and we have nutritionists, and we have social workers, and we have all of these different sort of sections. And, part of what drove me was the fact that I was like, no matter what degree I got, it never felt like enough. When I worked in community psychology or community therapy, I was like, okay, I'm doing the work in community, but I'm missing this other piece. And then as an osteopath, I never felt like I had enough of the psychological lens. And as a psychologist, I was like, where's the body?
Right.
Wait, were we just ignoring this whole thing here? That is part of this whole thing called the mind. And so I kept studying as a desire not to necessarily just know more, but to try to put back that sense of a holistic experience of our whole being, because trauma is an interruption in that sense of holism. So to approach it from an already fragmented perspective, which is psychology or osteopathy, isn't really going to give us a complete sense of healing.
Right.
Sorry, it's not. It's just not. Right. Because where there are so many doorways into the same trauma, and just trying to knock on the door, or just trying to knock on one door, will get you some area of processing and healing, but there might be very nonverbal movement processes. There might be, in relation to that trauma, a real deprivation of a nutritional supplement or a process of something that's not being absorbed, like vitamin D, for example. And so, there isn't really. I wish there was a career path where we learned all of that. It would probably, I've been in school 20 years, 15 years. So it would take a really long time.
Right.
But I'm a steadfast believer that it really needs to be this holistic approach. There needs to be movement and body work. I want to take away the word need. It would be opportune for everyone to have the experience of manual or body work, of movement work, of nutritional work, of body-oriented talk therapy, of just a sense of reintegration into spirituality or social community connection, because all of those are part of us. I'll say it again, trauma is where that sense of holism has been fragmented. And so it's really important that we kind of deconstruct how our career choices are, a micro or a version of that fragmentation.
Right.
And to then approach trauma is really important from a more holistic understanding.
So if we're looking at the drama queen,
who, me?
No, not you. Not me either.
Never.
Never. So we have that push-pull of wanting intimacy and being scared of it at the same time.
Yeah.
We don't want to feel too vulnerable. We have all kinds of defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
So, what's your take on? You've been doing this for a long time. So, what's your take on what happened to us during COVID and since then?
Oh, well, I can't speak for everyone. I, as an introvert, had a grand old time. So I'm not sure about everyone. I mean, grand all the time in the sense of
You didn't mind being at home.
no, gosh, no, no. I think it did a lot of things. I think it brought people in to what was happening on a lot of levels that had otherwise been ignored. The racial reckoning,
Mhm.
the sense of how important community is, connection is, the power of touch that isn't just sexual.
Mhm.
And so I think it brought also a lot of wounds to the surface, a lot of places and opportunities as well for people to dive into healing practices. We saw a massive boom in the healing industry.
Mhm.
Um, and also, we saw a lot of tension coming to the surface. I mean, I think that eventually people were navigating a lot of overstimulation and a lot of under movement, under processing, under expression, under touched,
Mhm.
under resourced in a lot of ways, and so we saw a lot of inner fighting and aggression and as well. And so I think when you say what happened for people in COVID, I think it's such a varied experience. But I think what I see in terms of mass patterns or mass collective patterns is a whole journey, and it's not one particular thing. And at times I think we saw again a lot of inner working until there was boredom or yeah, just not enough outer stimulus to balance that inner processing. Yeah. So I don't think there's one particular answer, but
Right.
I do think that it brought a lot to the surface that had otherwise been unseen and unfelt,
Mhm.
as most traumas do. Like
Right.
that's also the nature of like something happens, and and there's something really interesting about collective trauma like that, because there are social individuals and social locations that have navigated collective trauma or
Yes.
have been in collective trauma, even if they haven't navigated it.
Mhm.
Uh, and there, there's. I remember when I was in New York, September 11th, 2001.
Oh.
For those who are watching and don't know, that was when the planes went into the Twin Towers in New York City. That was my first day of college. And I was walking to school and saw it happen. And I had been in New York a week before, and I'm from Minnesota, as I said, where you say hello to people on the street, you smile, and you sometimes strike up a conversation just because. And in New York, I remember saying to my parents, I was like, it's so cold here. Like, no one smiles, no one talks to you. People look at me strange when I do smile.
Mhm.
And all of that shifted for a good portion of time for those of us who were there. And there is something about trauma that also often brings us closer. There's interesting research about how pain and suffering can bring a group closer. It can create bonding, which is an interesting component about trauma, but that's a later subject. And so there is something about collective trauma that can really bring people together in a way that they have something to bond over. And I think I want to recognize that amongst the incredible tragedy of so many deaths,
Mhm.
so many deaths. So
Right.
yeah.
Well, it seems like there was such a split talking about a loss of wholeness, um, even within families, within communities, with COVID and vaccines,
Yep.
and even now I'm seeing it of people who are like, "COVID's over, like get over it." And I'm sick of it. I'm choosing not to. I'm choosing to pretend it's not happening anymore. And I see that with a lot of people. And then for me, I'm still quite careful, and I feel kind of like the oddball out now, wearing a mask or wanting social distancing. And so if someone comes up behind me, I'm like, yeah, you need to back up 6 feet. you know and
Yep.
so I'm just really noticing there's so much. There was internally we have that split between mind body, or between safety and vulnerability, and all of that. And yet as a culture we also have people way on one side and way on the other side. It seems like we don't have as much middle ground anymore. There seems to be more on the extremes.
Yeah. So what I was saying earlier too about like how trauma brings things to the surface.
Right.
And for example, like you're in a particular relational dynamic that's painful. And there's a level of that pain that's true to that experience, but then it brings up all this stuff from the past, my attachment style, my past relationships. It's an associative memory process.
Hmm.
And so in that level of collective trauma, I don't know if there's more divide per se. I think it's just at the surface. It's enough trigger to activate so many other our own stuff that hadn't been processed before, that it just all came up and needed a container.
Right.
So anti-vax, vax, any of these things where we can find a duality, any place, even just our neighbor mowing the lawn too early, whatever. It's, when so much is coming up and we're not used to processing, we don't have the support systems or resources, we're going to deposit that somewhere. For some, we deposit it here, and it may look like depression. And we collapse, and we saw, an influx of that, certainly during the pandemic. And we also saw an influx of depositing that into social trolling, into political activism or political groups, extremist perspectives as well. Anywhere that felt like a container that could potentially hold that level of trauma that's being spewed. And that's not the individual's fault. That's no one's fault. I mean, that's a fault or challenge of a culture or society that hasn't given the ample support and resources for individuals to process what was underneath to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I see it more as a pure example of the need, and again, the need for more accessible work that touches the unspoken, or we might say the pre-verbal, which is more that somatic therapeutic work.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's happened the last couple of years is everybody talking about trauma, just like everyone's talking about the nervous system. And there's trauma informed everything now, okay? Which is a mixed blessing. So what's your take on that? Do you feel like everybody's traumatized?
You're asking a spicy question. I'm going to let everyone decide that on their own, but I will talk. How neutral is that? Yes. Here's the thing, that when a subject matter becomes so popularized, is that it can expand, which is great, and it can lose its clarity.
Mm-hmm.
It can become sort of generalized, of like, I ran into the wall earlier picking up my dog. I mean, I didn't run into the wall, I hit the wall picking up my dog. And I could say that was a trauma by some definitions. And so it becomes a little bit more generalized. And so which is okay in some areas. But what it can then become is we have all these ideas about what trauma is, and we're reacting to our experience based on those conceptions of what trauma is and what we see about trauma. And so it's piling a level of activation and stress, not just on our experience, but on our perceptual definition of what it is.
Right.
And so there's a bit complex because we're talking about neurolinguistics there, or physiological linguistics, which is a fun subject matter about like essentially how sometimes our reactions to something has nothing to do with the experience. It has to do with our definition or perceptual understanding of it more than it is the actual experience. Like running into the wall, I could say, ow. But if I say, oh, that was a trauma, then I'm adding the layer of what I perceive a trauma is and what needs to be done based on that trauma, because that's what I read about it, or I see it so much on social media. And therefore, I am traumatized. And therefore, I start to form identity formations around that sense that I have been traumatized. I am traumatized. I am wounded. I'm, etc. And it can go down into a spiral as opposed to being like, I'm a whole person that has a trauma, which means that something has thwarted my experience of that wholeness. Someone has usurped my power. Someone hasn't offered me the stimulus or the love that I need. And the trauma is the absence of the stimuli as opposed to the overwhelm of it. So there's a way in which when it becomes identity formation, because it's become more generalized, because there's a certain ease in associating with it, it can lose its clarity, because when we are relating to it from an identity formation, I'm a traumatized person. You can even hear again, going back to neurolinguistics, you can hear in my language that it's not coming from me. I'm almost referencing myself. The language has a dissociative quality to it. And when I'm outside myself, referencing myself, I'm not in here to actually process and heal. So something in me feels blocked. Something in me is hurting and feeling like disconnected from my upper and my lower. You can hear the change in language that's different from I'm in the here now versus I'm in an identity formation around trauma. And that's a big important difference when actually working with trauma. And a big important difference when we start identifying in relationship to our experiences. I can also get stuck in the idea of my experience and the identity formation of my experience versus what's actually here and now. I certainly come from a background that's, one might say, was quite traumatizing. And if I go back and I try to associate with the memories of that, but there's nothing actually here, but I identify the story and say I'm a traumatized individual. Versus when I go back to it and say, what's here now? What wants to be seen and recognized and processed here? It's a very different process of healing.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So body-based somatic healing, somebody maybe is realizing that there's some blockage, that they're stuck, there's some trauma there. And then we have that whole associative part of the mind that always says, well, you think that's bad. Remember back when that happened and we're back to the drama queen in a way. But how do people, what's a way in for people? There's so much now. And what kind of work do you do? What do you?
Well, in all fairness, I've studied nearly every somatic modality. I was hungry for somatics. So I do an amalgamation, I would say, of a lot of different somatic approaches. There's somatic experiencing, there's polyvagal informed types of therapies, there's body-based kind of EMDR, there's Gestalt, there's so many beautiful modalities. Mm-hmm. And that's again why on the Embody Lab we wanted to create a home where all of these could be and not be in competition with each other. And I created a modality, which is a kind of a funny thing for me to say. Because I'm not like, "Oh, I founded this." This is just not how I operate. But I have a love and a passion for something I call somatic stress release,
Mm-hmm.
which is a modality that I teach, which is bringing in a lot of the components specifically around stress that were left out: the body work, the therapeutic lens, the movement work, I said body work, the nutrition work, all of that. So that was my love project of bringing a lot of these modalities back, or a lot of these lenses back into one modality. It took me a long time to learn this, and I would imagine most practitioners like yourself, after a certain amount of years, you go, "Oh, it's not about the modality of their techniques. It's what meets this person in this given moment with these given circumstances that could support this process of healing." And so I love so many modalities, and I don't practice just one because they each have informed um, me in a way of working with people, or teaching, that I think is more about this sort of, I don't know if you've ever done like improv, dance improv, or acting improv, where it's like, it's, I have such a joy with that. And it's the ability to really be in the moment, and navigate with what's here, as opposed to relying on a script.
Right.
And so often the techniques can kind of be a script, as that give you the confidence on the stage, but they should give us the confidence to then be able to improvise within that,
Right.
with that person. Yeah.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of improvising jazz on my flute.
Oh, cool.
And so you have a structure, you
Yeah.
have a basic structure, but then within that, there's a lot of freedom. And one thing I noticed right away is that when I'm well regulated and calm, I'm very creative. When I'm not, I'm not. And so
Interesting.
something that opens up our body and movement, I think, is really
Yeah.
kind of scary for people, probably,
Yeah.
but it's very powerful too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll do a shaking and dancing and
Mm.
breathing practice with people, and it really not people, I, as well as everybody else. It's very energizing and freeing, and
Yeah.
trauma work is not just about serious and
Oh gosh. Yeah, I mean, let's look at our first language. Our first sensory language, as humans, is not talking.
mm,
That came years later. So we had our primal foundational language is movement. It's our first pathway to
mhm,
develop in the on our nervous system, as in utero.
mhm,
It's our first feedback mechanism. And so touch and movement are our first senses to develop. Kinesthesia, proprioception, interoception, um, all those fancy fun words. It's what it's saying is movement and touch are our first languages.
right,
And so when the idea that we treat something that is pre-verbal with just talking doesn't like, when you put it that way, it really doesn't make any sense. But if you connect someone back to their primary language with a primal response, which trauma is, it's very primal,
mhm.
then suddenly we're matching languages in a way that we can't any other way do.
I have a client that I work with who dances
Mm-hmm.
and goes to the beach, walks on the beach. And if she can't do that for whatever reason, it's really hard. It's like that's really an integral part of her therapy, her trauma therapy. She's got
Yeah.
a lot of trauma, big trauma history, and she, when she's able to do that, she feels more settled. She feels more at home. When she's not, she has a fierce binge eating disorder.
Mm.
And the dancing and the kind of that strong thing about being at the beach and in the waves and that kind of energy output really helps her to be stable.
Yeah.
And the sensations in the body as well. So if we circle back to addiction,
Yeah.
so a lot of people are quite reluctant to feel the sensations in their body.
Sure.
So what's the process of, we know trauma is stored in the body. We know that those sensations have associated memories. So
Mhm.
how do you work with people to kind of work with that?
Look, and I would say there's not one particular way because some of us have an innate access towards that primal language.
Hmm.
So um, that's still a vocabulary, a lexicon that's like, oh, I got that. That's easy. That's still part of me. And for others, it's been masked up, or because of um, perhaps trauma, that language of the sensation of the body is is not available. So it's really like this scale of availability of that primal language, which we assess even within a first session. It's like what's available, and that then determines kind of an entry point. Do I go right into, and how does that feel in your body, which is a big question.
Hmm.
And then having someone kind of actually touch into that sensation. And that's just a way to get more contact with what's here, to then be able to process, to feel what's the impulse of that. What's this narrative, or what's the story that comes with this sensation, or the memories, or movements. And for others, it's, you say, how does that feel in your body? And there's just a blank stare. And
Hmm.
that's totally fine. And so you might just pick up a weight and say, with one hand, pick up a weight. Can you feel the difference in the musculature of your body between one hand and the other? Cool. Let's just hang out with that. So sometimes it's about stepping into refamiliarizing someone with, they have a body, and that body feels something. And there's an organic intelligence and a variety of sensations within that. And that can take years.
Hmm.
And that's fine. It takes the time it needs to take. So I would say that's kind of a foundational entry point into a lot of somatics, is kind of recognizing where someone is in relation to themselves. Is it, you can tell a lot even from the language, as I sort of gave the example before about how does an individual talk from their experience, or do they talk about it almost as their witness to themselves,
Right.
or or neither in some
Right.
instances? Yeah. All they can talk about is other people.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so when people are disconnected in that way,
Mhm.
disconnected from knowing what's going on in their body, or disconnected, I think a lot of times people are disconnected from if they're in a fight response, what they're saying, or there's a
Mhm.
lot of disconnection.
Sure.
So, how is it that people get inspired to believe that this is worth doing? What's your take on that?
It may not be. It may not be worth doing.
People may not.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. I think there's value in a lot of the work, but I mean, one of the things I often say is like, healing is really hard,
Right.
and it's extraordinarily difficult to rebuild your house while it's being knocked down.
Right.
And so, like, this process of like, is it worth it? Yeah, I mean, hopefully we have other people's examples as motivation or inspiration, or often the thing that is challenging us or ailing us has to be worse, has to be at a level that
Right.
feels like it's worth expending the energy to change. It is, even if we're in a destructive pattern, it takes a significant amount of energy to change towards something that's not destructive. So it's also like, does someone have the resources to get that energy in order to change and heal? It's not just like, there are other social cultural factors beyond just the internal motivation. Is it safe to heal? Sometimes no. Sometimes it's not, because that might mean I become more in touch with the amount of rage and that's dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, I think that there's a lot of, when I think about my own journey, say like that, the inspiration, I wasn't inspired. I think I just hit rock bottom. And that was all I had. And, I talk about that in the book too. It's not like I'm like, oh, I want to heal this. Sucks. So I'm just going to go heal it. It's like, I no longer had a choice. I was basically just so ill, especially physically, that I was no longer functioning.
Right.
And so, and then every time I thought I would, just go, I'm fine, I'm just going to keep going and push past it, things just kept falling apart. And in retrospect, I feel very grateful that my life fell apart and I hit rock bottom, and then realized that wasn't even rock bottom and kept doing it. And that was and so sometimes that's the piece that allows us to change. And other times it's like, hey, my relationships don't feel good anymore. Or they haven't felt good, or I'm not satisfied. And that can be the motivation to change. Or just general curiosity and inquiry might be the motivation to change. So I think for many of us, I give that sort of breadth of examples because I want to humanize it. It's not just like we're pepped up and ready to heal.
It's a lot more complicated than that. Well, and also I like how you keep referring back to all of the variables. So there's our culture, our society, our families, the kind of experiences we're in right now. Yeah. And lots of times people will kind of back away because they're starting to get a sense of, if I actually do this healing work, that relationship I'm in, I'm out of here. Yeah. And I can't afford to do that for whatever reason.
The people around us will be the last to accept our healing process and change, because they have ground and anchoring in the identity of who we are as they know us. Right. So it takes a lot of energy to repattern how and what they know of us and allow that to be the new truth. And so that's a real factor too. And we might lose people in that process. We often do.
We often do, yeah. So it's not just like someone who's drinking all the time has to basically lose that friendship group if they're going to not drink. Maybe some people can manage that, but for the most part, it's hard to stay in an addictive environment when you're trying to get clean.
The complexity of an addicted, those of us with navigating addictions, is that sometimes we find ourselves in community or groups who enable us, or who are part of their own addictive spiral. And the complexity of that is that community is one of the things that is most healing for addiction. The opposite of addiction is not abstinence, it's belonging. Belonging. Yeah. Right. And so the complexity of that is when we're in a community or we're in a group where we are in our own trauma reenactments, and that manifests as addiction, that when we remove ourselves from that, we might experience some sense of loneliness and isolation, which is like pouring water on a plant called addiction. Right. And so it's complex, but quite possibly, even though we were in that group or we perceived ourselves in that community, we may not have felt true belonging. which is often the case when we are in our trauma reenactment called addiction, is we might be there, but we're alone in relation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's often the case.
So can you say more about true belonging? What does it feel like when you're healed enough, not perfectly, of course, but healed enough to feel like you're at home in yourself, you know who you are, you're vulnerable with other people? Talk about that a bit.
I think you just said it perfectly. Yeah. I mean, true belonging, and it's one of those things again that trying to find the language for it almost dismisses the awe of the actual experience, because there is no language that can ever really truly define such a primal sense of being, and primal sense of belonging, where, I mean, we can try. We have poets and even scholars, philosophers who in their own ways have tried to find the language to define love or belonging. Songs.
Mm-hmm.
And the closest I can come up with my limited vocabulary is something like, where I can feel me, I can feel you, and I can feel we. And there's a sense that I belong in myself. I belong in relationship to you simultaneously. And often I find that somewhere along that it can get skewed, where it's like, I belong to you. Or enmeshment, yeah. Mm-hmm. You belong to me, power. Or I can receive you, but I can't express me. So there's no actual meeting. There's no bidirectionality in that relationship. So relationship has this bidirectionality. And the opening of that channel is what we call vulnerability, that allows it to come in and through and express back out and still be here in myself and in relation to you. And that sense of what all of that comes together is a sense of being and belonging. Being and belonging.
So knowing ourselves and feeling safe enough to express who we are.
Yeah. And receive.
And receive.
And receive.
Right.
Yeah.
So getting back to the therapist, the modality isn't as important as the presence.
Yeah. No, we know that from many studies, the dodo effect studies that say how someone is with someone is a bigger contributing factor than the modality they practice.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what's it like for you with Embody Lab? I mean, that's such a big project. It must be exciting.
Yeah, I love it. I get to curate some of my best friends. I get to hang out with my mentors all the time. Stephen Porges and Peter Levine and Dan Siegel, and and bring all of these voices into a harmonic program with that has an arc and a learning process. Yeah, it's kind of what I always dreamed of, and then was able to get manifested and created. And yeah, I just I love the team. The team is so, organized and sweet and loving, and it's I have started several companies in my life, and to my best attempt and failed. One of the ethos of what the content was to be the environment of the internal workings. And this is the first time after many years of trying to failing and figuring out why it didn't work and whatnot, that the internal world of it, the background, the people in it, has the same love that is expressed to the outer world in the way that it's manifested, the way that the programs are running, the things that are created. So, I mean, like when you go to a good restaurant and it just feels like the chef is cooking with love,
Yes.
and everyone, and like things are copacetic and you can taste it in the food.
Mm.
That's what is one of the things that I feel so happy about. The when I said the harmonic nature of it, like all of these voices of these teachers that are rising, and these mentors that are passing the baton, and the interfacing of those voices and that wisdom into this harmonic process where it's not just like thrown at you, but actually, because it's based on embodiment, it's like it's almost like a transmuting, a transfer, an offering to those who are in the programs and taking it.
And so people can we'll put some links to that too here, but people can take individual programs and then you have longer term programs as well.
Yeah, we have workshops and we have mini certificate programs, and then we have longer certificate programs. We have our membership, which is like bi-monthly sessions with my mentors like Peter Levine, Dan Siegel, so many others, Stephen Porges. And so there's lots of different ways in. And a big piece of our mission was also more scholarships. So we have given out an enormous amount of scholarships as part of our mission, and we'll continue to do so because accessibility is such an important factor for us.
It is, yeah. And so people get to know each other as well, like participants. So if your family or other people are like, I'm not cool with all this healing you're doing, you can come there and meet like-minded people.
We have online forums where like our community connects, and it's not on social media, which is we have a social media group, but we also created one that's off social media so that those who are just needing a break or done, or just needing a protective space that isn't being spammed with other things.
Right. And what about working with you? I know someone who's just been through one of your big courses and loved it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you offer?
What I'm teaching?
Like how people could connect with you through your work.
Sure. Primarily, I'm just teaching right now, and it's on the Embody Lab. And I teach in a few of the programs. I teach in our trauma training program. So I teach in several of our programs, and that includes our trauma therapy training program, which brings together a lot of those incredible teachers. And I get to teach in that. I'm one of the co-directors. And I'm also teaching and co-directing our somatic attachment therapy program, which I also just love. I love that we're remodeling the concept of attachment theory, which is beautiful foundational work and outdated, very outdated. And we're bringing in a lot of voices that really look at transgenerational healing and indigenous healing approaches to relationships. And so, and really looking at the relationship with, the earth and with spirit and with each other. And how do we heal the individual, our own relationship with ourselves before trying to just jump into relationship with someone else? And I also teach the somatic stress release training on the Embody Lab as well, and a couple other components. Yeah. So those are like the majority of where my teaching hour time is these days.
Right. And so do you still meet with clients individually as well?
I do, just one day a week.
One day a week.
I was doing 6 days a week for many, many years.
Right.
Many years. And I just needed to devote the majority of my attention to sort of this mission of, in some ways, passing the baton, or supporting that passing the baton, and making the rich material of somatic and somatic psychology and somatic therapy and somatic social justice work, again, just more out there in the world.
Right. Yeah. I find that too. And, for all there is a huge value of one-to-one work. I think there's also a huge value to group work and getting to know each other and realizing it's not just the teacher top down.
Yeah.
It's a real communal experience and process.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And healing happens on a lot of different levels. Like, we take that public health lens model, and it happens on the individual level, it happens in community level, it happens in governmental, cultural levels, and all of those are needed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's also why our programs are open to who can join. People who are doing work in schools and people who are doing work in government should be taking the same trauma-informed programming as a therapist.
Right.
How they use the material, embody it, and apply it is individual, but it's all the same significant information and processes that are needed in any medium, because trauma doesn't just exist in a one-on-one therapy session. Trauma does show up in our school systems. We know that, especially in the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows up in our workforce. It shows up in everywhere. There's nowhere that it can hide.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's one thing about so much more awareness about trauma now, is that I think people are starting to see, as a culture, we don't have a very healthy way of connecting with ourselves and with each other. And, sometimes I look at the intergenerational components and I do see that I think we're improving, but it feels like it's a big job. There's a lot there that's being harmful, it's been disconnecting, and it's so possible to connect with ourselves and other people. So what would your final words be? We're just about out of time here. What would you like to finish with?
I think something I've been thinking about a lot is, it sounds so simple, but have fun. I think, we're at a summit, we're in these very, not necessarily serious, but very process oriented programs or interests, or we're reading books about trauma or addiction. And I think we can get engrossed in the vortex of self-healing. And I think there's a lot of social media posts. I think there's a lot of enticing stuff, coming to and heal more and heal more. And I think some of my final words are rest and play. Restore your energy, because it takes that energy to heal ourselves, takes energy to heal the world, and to come back and see what restores you is part of the healing process, even if we're not processing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in your own life, you've gone from 6 days a week of working with other people to doing this thing that you love. It's clear that you love what you're doing with Embody Lab and the other work you're doing. So that's so amazing.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. It's been great to have this time to talk and to get to know you a bit better and your work, and to share that with people.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for watching the Radical Recovery Summit 2023. To watch more of the interviews and the clips, and to share with your friends, please go to radicalrecoverysummit.com.